The evening in Chicago felt like a fleeting moment of tranquility amidst the whirlwind of the city's endless energy. The streets hummed with the distant sounds of traffic, but inside a small, quaint diner nestled on a quiet corner, everything seemed to slow down. The diner, unassuming in its appearance, had been a favorite of locals for years, a place that radiated nostalgia with its old-school booths, red vinyl seats, and the faint scent of frying bacon wafting through the air. Kayla and Tamara Johnson had chosen this spot for its charm and peaceful atmosphere. Both women were used to the chaos of the world, especially after the intense weeks of military training they had just completed. They longed for the simplicity of an ordinary evening, a brief escape from the constant vigilance of their highly demanding lives. They had come to this place for a quiet dinner, hoping that for once they could just be two sisters, enjoying a night out, without the threat of violence or danger lurking just around the corner. Kayla, the older of the two by only a few minutes, sat back in her booth, her leather jacket hugging her frame like a second skin. She exuded an aura of quiet strength. Even in a setting like this, with nothing particularly threatening in sight, there was something about her that made people pause when they saw her. Her eyes were sharp, constantly scanning, taking in everything around her, but her posture was relaxed, like a lion at rest, always prepared yet calm. Tamara, on the other hand, radiated warmth. Her white hoodie contrasted sharply with Kayla's darker tones, and her presence was soft yet undeniably intense. Her easy smile and open demeanor could fool anyone into thinking she was just another face in the crowd. But beneath that was a woman who had been through the worst the world could offer, and come out the other side stronger. Her gaze was softer, more approachable, but no less perceptive. She, too, was always on alert, but she hid it better than most. The two sisters sat there, sipping on steaming mugs of coffee, their conversation drifting between lighthearted teasing and serious, introspective reflections about their recent missions. They spoke of their training, of near misses, of the terrifying thrill of combat, and more often than not, of the bond they shared as siblings. There was a comfort in their words, in the familiar rhythm of their dialogue. They were each other's rock, their support system, and as always, they found solace in each other's presence. "So," Tamara began, her voice light, "who do you think has the better aim? You or me?" Kayla raised an eyebrow, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "You mean, who missed more times, right?" Tamara rolled her eyes, laughing. "I still hit the target more times than you. Not on the day you lost your bet, remember?" "Ugh, don't remind me," Tamara groaned. "I thought I had it in the bag." Kayla chuckled, taking another sip of her coffee, enjoying the ease of the moment. But as she leaned back in her seat, her eyes flickered to the door, the familiar sense of unease creeping in. She had learned long ago that no situation, no matter how seemingly ordinary, could be trusted to stay that way. Something in the air had shifted. A new energy had entered the room. Before she could process it, the door to the diner slammed open with a sharp, jarring sound. The noise was so abrupt that it sent a shiver through the room, drawing every pair of eyes toward the group that had just entered. 5 men, loud and brash, stood in the doorway, their presence overwhelming. The harsh laughter that followed them was like nails on a chalkboard, grating, dissonant, and full of malice. Kayla's hand instinctively went to her side, where her body was trained to react, to prepare for conflict. Tamara, ever perceptive, could feel the tension building and straightened up, her smile fading just slightly as she locked eyes with Kayla. The leader of the group, a large man with a shaved head and a Confederate flag tattoo stretching down his forearm, surveyed the room with an almost predatory gaze. His eyes passed over the diners, sizing them up one by one, until they landed on the two sisters sitting quietly in the back corner booth. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, a look that was anything but friendly. "Well, well, well," the man said loudly, enough for everyone to hear. His voice was dripping with mockery, an exaggerated drawl that only made his words sound more insulting. "Double trouble, huh?" The room's atmosphere shifted in an instant. Conversations faltered, forks clinked against plates, and suddenly every eye in the diner was on Kayla and Tamara. The energy had changed. It was no longer a peaceful night of coffee and conversation. It was a standoff. The waitress, a young woman with a name tag that read Julie, froze behind the counter. Her hand hovered over the coffee pot, unsure whether to serve more customers or to retreat to safety. The men's laughter echoed off the walls, but there was no humor in it. There was a sinister edge to their words, a weight that pressed down on everyone in the room. Even the air itself seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive. But the sisters? They didn't flinch. Kayla's eyes narrowed slightly, the only sign of tension in her otherwise calm face. She knew better than to react immediately. Every movement, every glance was measured. Tamara, sensing the shift in Kayla's demeanor, raised an eyebrow. It was the unspoken question between them. Are we really doing this today? Kayla's response was a brief nod, a silent assurance that they were ready for whatever was coming. It wasn't their first time dealing with men like this, but it was clear from the way the leader was looking at them that this situation wasn't going to be as simple as ignoring their taunts and walking away. The leader's smirk grew wider, and he stepped closer to the sisters' booth. He leaned against the edge of the table, towering over them. One of his companions, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, stepped forward and hovered just behind him, eyeing the sisters with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "What are two girls like you doing here?" the man sneered, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else? This is no place for you." Kayla didn't flinch. Instead, she placed her coffee mug down slowly, deliberately, her gaze never leaving the man's face. Her voice was calm even, but it carried an unmistakable authority. "We're just here to have coffee. Move along." For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that stretches just long enough for everyone to realize that something has changed. Then behind the man, the leader of the group spoke again, his voice louder, more forceful. "You think you can just tell me what to do?" His words were a challenge, sharp and full of venom. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who doesn't belong here." Tamara's grip tightened around her coffee cup. Her knuckles whitened as a wave of anger surged beneath her calm exterior, but she didn't react. She stayed still, her body poised like a coiled spring, ready to move if needed. The room seemed to hold its breath. The tension was thick, suffocating. Even the waitress, Julie, couldn't bring herself to make a move. Her gaze darted nervously between the group of men and the sisters. The people around them seemed to shrink back, unwilling to get involved. And yet, in the midst of all this, Kayla and Tamara sat unmoving, like rocks in the middle of a storm, calm and collected. Kayla's hand shifted slightly, brushing against Tamara's wrist. The briefest of touches, a reminder to stay calm, to avoid escalation. They had been through this before, and they knew exactly what to do. The leader, clearly not pleased with the lack of response, leaned in closer, his grin widening. His breath was hot and stale, and Kayla could feel the heat of his presence in her space. He pulled out a chair and spun it around, dropping into it with a deliberate slowness. He rested his elbows on the table, his eyes never leaving the sisters. "You think you're in charge here?" he mocked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "We need to teach you too who really runs this place." It was at that moment, with the weight of the situation mounting, that Kayla knew this wasn't going to be a simple altercation. This was a challenge, an attempt to break their calm. But what the leader and his crew didn't realize was that Kayla and Tamara weren't ordinary women. They were soldiers, trained in the most intense conditions imaginable. And their composure wasn't a sign of fear or weakness. It was a weapon in itself. But Kayla kept her focus. She turned back to the leader and spoke in a low, steady voice, her words calculated and calm. "We don't want trouble. Let's not make this worse than it needs to be." For a moment, the leader's grin faltered, as though he might reconsider. But then the laughter of his crew grew louder, harsher. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Then the first hand reached out, aiming directly for Kayla's shoulder. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment his hand made contact with Kayla's shoulder, everything erupted. It was like a switch was flipped, and in that split second, the world around the sisters faded. Kayla's focus narrowed to nothing but the hand on her shoulder, the hand that dared to invade her space. Without hesitation, her body moved. Instinct, honed by years of training, took over. Her hand shot out like a cobra, grabbing the wrist of the man who had dared touch her. She twisted it with brutal efficiency, using his momentum against him. His scream of pain echoed through the diner, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. In one swift movement, Kayla shoved him forward, sending him crashing into the table. The sound of his knees hitting the hard surface reverberated through the room, a shock wave that made everyone freeze. But the sisters didn't stop. Tamara, who had been watching the entire exchange with a calm, calculating gaze, saw her sister spring into action. She knew it was only a matter of time before things escalated. With a fluid motion, Tamara slid out of her booth and stood, her stance ready for whatever came next. The leader of the group, who had been too busy watching his companion fall to the ground, finally turned his attention to Tamara. The grin on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. It didn't last long. "You've made a big mistake, lady," the leader growled, his voice dripping with venom. He stepped toward her, his boots scraping against the floor like a predator closing in on its prey. Behind him, his gang started to close in too. But they didn't realize they had just crossed the line. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Without a word, Tamara moved, quicker than anyone could follow. As the leader lunged toward her, she stepped aside, her body shifting like a dancer, fluid, controlled, and precise. With a swift kick to his ankle, she sent him sprawling. His body hit the floor with a sickening thud, the air thick with the sound of his pride cracking along with his fall. His men stood frozen for a moment, eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to go down. But Kayla wasn't finished. Kayla stood tall, her calm expression unwavering as the other two members of the gang approached her, eyes narrowed and fists clenched. One of them, a burly man with a scar over his right eyebrow, swung a punch aimed at her head. It was slow, telegraphed, and Kayla had already anticipated it. With an effortless duck, Kayla evaded the punch. She moved in close, closing the distance between them. Her elbow found its mark, right into his ribs. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, as the sound of his breath leaving his lungs echoed through the diner. His partner swung a wild punch, but Kayla was ready. She ducked under it, and with a quick jab to his gut, he crumpled to the floor, his air knocked out of his body. The leader groaned in the background, pushing himself to his feet with a mix of frustration and confusion. How had it come to this? How had two women managed to take down four men without breaking a sweat? Behind the counter, Julie, the waitress, had retreated into the safety of the kitchen, her heart racing, but her mind was also clear. She knew this wasn't just a random fight. This was something much bigger, something that was slowly dawning on her. She grabbed her phone from her pocket, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. Meanwhile, Tamara was handling the last man, the wiry one with the scruffy beard who had gotten too close earlier. His eyes were wide now, no longer filled with the same bravado. Instead, there was a flicker of fear, but also desperation. He pulled a knife from his jacket, the blade flashing under the harsh diner lights. Tamara's gaze locked onto the weapon. She took a step forward, closing the distance. The man hesitated for only a second, and that was all Tamara needed. With a single swift motion, she grabbed his wrist, twisting it violently. The knife flew from his hand and clattered to the floor, sliding under the counter. The man let out a strangled yelp of pain, his face contorted with shock as Tamara shoved him backward. The last of the group, the leader, had recovered enough to try his luck again, but his confidence was shattered. His crew was broken, and he had nowhere to go. He grabbed a bottle off the nearest table, desperation flashing in his eyes. He hurled it at Tamara, hoping to land a hit, but his aim was off, way off. Tamara caught the bottle in midair. It was like something out of a movie, the way her fingers wrapped around the neck of the bottle, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. She didn't even look at him as she placed the bottle down gently on the table, her eyes meeting his with a simmering intensity. "You're outmatched," she said, her voice low and calm, yet firm. "Walk away while you still can." For a long moment, the leader stood there staring at her, the weight of her words hitting harder than any punch could. His breathing was heavy, his arrogance cracked, replaced by something else, fear. His crew, battered and broken, started to retreat. The room was still filled with their groans and the sound of their heavy footsteps as they backed away from the sisters. The leader hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between Kayla and Tamara. But he knew when he was beaten. With a low growl, he motioned for his men to leave. "Don't think this is over," he spat, as he and his crew turned to leave, dragging their injured comrades with them. The door slammed behind them, and the diner fell silent. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Outside, the sound of sirens began to grow louder. Police cars screeched to a halt, and within seconds, officers poured into the diner, their guns drawn, their voices sharp and commanding. "Hands up, nobody move," one officer shouted as he approached the sisters. Kayla and Tamara exchanged a quick glance. They raised their hands slowly, their faces unreadable. But inside, they knew what had to come next. They had been in worse situations before, but this one felt different. There was a momentary flicker of unease, but it didn't show on their faces. As the officers moved in, the sisters calmly explained the situation, each one keeping their story consistent. They spoke of self-defense, of being attacked by the group of men. But despite their calm explanations and the testimonies of the few witnesses who had been brave enough to speak up, the sisters were cuffed and escorted outside. The gang members, however, were treated differently. Some were questioned, but none were cuffed. The leader, now sporting a smug grin despite the chaos, walked past Kayla and Tamara as he was loaded into the back of a squad car. He leaned in close to Tamara, whispering in her ear. "You haven't seen the last of us," he sneered. Tamara's jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Kayla gave her a subtle shake of the head, a silent command for restraint. This wasn't the time. But as they were loaded into separate squad cars, the look in Tamara's eyes spoke volumes. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The police station was cold, unforgiving. Officers interrogated Kayla and Tamara as if they were the ones who had committed the crime, grilling them about their military backgrounds, trying to paint them as dangerous. "So, you're special forces?" One officer sneered as he flipped through their file. "I'm sure that's why you acted the way you did." Kayla's response was calm but sharp. "My approach? You mean defending myself when attacked? Isn't that what you're supposed to do?" Across the hall, Tamara was facing a similar line of questioning. "Your training makes you dangerous in situations like this," her interrogator suggested. Tamara's laugh was humorless. "Dangerous? The only danger that night was 5 grown men harassing us. Funny how you're not asking them about their choices." Meanwhile, outside the station, Ray Dixon, the gang leader, was spreading a twisted version of the events. He had edited footage, made sure to paint Kayla and Tamara as the aggressors, sparking headlines that ignored his gang's provocations. But the sisters weren't going to stay silent. They called their commanding officer, who activated powerful allies. Unedited footage, eyewitness testimonies, and security recordings surfaced, revealing the ugly truth of the gang's actions. Social media exploded with support. Justice for the Johnson sisters went viral, and public outcry forced the local news to backtrack. The sisters didn't stop there. At a press conference, they calmly dismantled the lies. "We defended ourselves because no one else would," Kayla said, her voice steady. "And now we're being vilified for refusing to stay silent." "This isn't just about us," Tamara added. "It's about every woman who has had to fight to be heard." Under immense pressure, the police department apologized, and federal agents arrested Dixon and his crew. The gang leader, his smug grin replaced by fear, was finally facing justice. Kekushan. As the sisters sat on their porch watching the sunset, they knew the battle was behind them, but far from forgotten. "You think they'll stay scared?" Kayla asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Tamara's gaze was steady, her voice unwavering. But we're ready for whatever's next."